Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 245 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. As you know, I've been talking a lot lately about King Philip IV, or Philip the Fair, of France, because of the mini-series I've been doing about his reign as part of Dan Jones's This Is History podcast. But there are a heck of a lot more interesting and history-shaping members of Philip's centuries-long royal dynasty. If, like so many of us, your knowledge of French kings tends to be a few facts about Charlemagne and maybe a nugget or two about St. Louis, I'm happy to say that this is the episode for you, because if something important happened in the High Middle Ages, one Capetian or another had their hands in it. This week, I spoke with Dr. Justine Firnhaber-Baker about the fierce and fascinating Capetian dynasty. Justine is a professor of history at the University of St. Andrews, and you might remember her from the last time she was on this podcast when we spoke about her book, The Jacquerie of 1358, A French Peasants' Revolt. Since we last chatted, Justine has been working hard on her new book, House of Lilies, the dynasty that made medieval France. It's a book that introduces the unforgettable Capetians with all the highlights, lowlights, silliness, and scandals, and it's getting a lot of well-deserved buzz. Our conversation on who the Capetians were, how they made medieval France, and how they changed the world is coming up right after this. Well, welcome back, Justine. I am so pleased to be talking to you about your new book. Welcome back.
Thank you. I am so pleased to be talking to you again. It kind of seems like just yesterday we were talking about the Jacquerie book.
I know. And here we are back digging into French history. And it's so exciting for both you and me who totally adore it. But one of the things that you say in the book, and one of the things that we've both discovered, is there's really not all that much about French history. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, certainly not in English. Partly there is that language barrier. It's kind of interesting being an academic, an English-speaking academic in Britain who has come from medieval history training in the US, particularly at Harvard, which was always really a center of French history under Haskins and then under Joseph Strayer, and then Strayer trained my supervisor, Tom Bisson, who trained me, right? Mm-hmm. So, there is kind of a tradition there, but certainly English language medieval historians tend to work on England. That's even more so true here in Britain than it is in the US. We have a lot more Iberianists now than we used to. And that's a great thing. There is some tradition around Italy, particularly Florence. Oh, but then Germany, things get real scarce once you're looking for English language people writing on Germany. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I wanted to do with the book was to bring this history to people who maybe do know something about the Plantagenets, or they know about the Crusades, right? But really, those histories make a lot more sense once you know what's going on in France. And of course, that history itself is just fascinating.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting as you're talking, I'm thinking about all of the big historians that you're mentioning, like Joseph Strayer. But in the North American tradition, there's so much like French literature that we learn, but we don't learn the history behind it. And as you say, it makes so much more sense when you read them together. And this is intuitive, and yet it doesn't happen all that much. So what are you covering in this book? What did you take on as your project here?
Okay, so the book covers the entirety of the Capetian dynasty, or what we sometimes call the direct Capetians. So that dynasty, historians sort of officially start the beginning of the dynasty in 987. We might talk about sort of the foreshadowing what came before that in a bit. But then from 987 on, this dynasty rules in an unbroken line of father to son succession until 1316. And then there are a couple of brothers who succeeded one another after that. The last one dies in 1328. So I'm dealing with that entire period of 987 to 1328. And it's not just sort of the story of this family, it's really the story of the making of medieval France, which is the subtitle of the book. Because when you look at France in 987, it doesn't look anything like France in 1328. France in 1328 more or less looks territorially something akin to modern France. And it has many of the features that we really associate with the Middle Ages and maybe with France in particular. You've got Gothic churches, you've got chivalry, you've got a sort of courtly love tradition, you've got the French language. You've got the Crusades. You've got this real identity as a Catholic, crusading, Orthodox people. But that all coalesces over the course of the Capetian dynasty's reigns, and in large part because of conscious choices they make and some unconscious things they do as well. So, they don't do it alone, but in many ways it is their creation.
Yes. And one of the things that you do in this book is really sort of pull out these Capetians as people. And I'm bringing this up because it's something that you address in the foreword, saying some people say it's unwise to look at these people and humanize them or like give them a character, but I'm going to do it anyway. Can you tell us about that process?
Yeah. Okay, there are a couple of things there that I'm going to defend on both on methodological grounds as well as artistic ones. So I do think of myself sort of fundamentally as a social historian of power. I am really interested in who people are and what their relationships are and how their social contexts help to shape what they do. And I do think as a human being, but also as a historian, that your relationships determine a lot about what you do. I think very much that history is, even when you're doing something like, say, an intellectual history project, the development of an idea, let's say the development of the idea that the state has exclusive authority to wage war. Those ideas are not divorced from people. Right?
Yes.
People
Yeah.
have those ideas, and they have those ideas because they are interacting with other people. And so you always have to keep that social aspect in mind as a historian, even if you are then going to write a rather disembodied history. You need to think about the people. History is about people. But then thinking about writing this book and the audience for this book, and I really thought about my own experiences when I was first introduced to medieval history as a teenager, first by a biography of Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Of course.
Yeah, that Marion Mead, Eleanor of Aquitaine biography. And that really made quite an impression on me, as did a book on the Armagnac Burgundian Civil War called In a Dark Wood Wandering. That, is just fabulous, which is fictional, but drawn very much from the Chronicles. And so I wanted people to have that experience. I wanted there to be a plot and characters. Now, all of those things are drawn directly from the primary sources. And when I'm imagining something, I tell you, I say, we can imagine the Countess standing in front of the palace as the king rides in, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether for sure whether she was there or not, let alone what she was thinking. But I can imagine it for you. And, I can imagine it within certain boundaries. I'm not making it up out of whole cloth. It was really important. This book is my big chance to bring a love of the Capetians to people who otherwise wouldn't know about them. And part of that is making these characters, making these people real for you.
Yeah. I'm totally on board with that project because, yeah, you don't make a decision without being influenced by everything around you. And especially that has to do with people. So bringing these people out and putting them in the forefront and even adding a little bit of a sprinkling of imagination with the correct flags that this is imagination. I think it's the best way to do history. So, yeah, I think it really works. Okay, so we need to start with a fundamental character who is not a Capetian, but we need to sort of base everything on him because that is what the Capetians do as well. And then, of course, is Charlemagne. So who is this guy, and what do things look like under him as a way of starting into the Capetian dynasty?
Okay, Charlemagne, which is actually where the prologue of the book begins, with this
Mm.
description of Charlemagne from the Song of Roland. And he really is the foundational figure. I mean, even today, some people say, oh, Charlemagne, he's the father of Europe, right?
Yeah.
So Charlemagne was originally king of the Franks, who are Germanic people who, at that point in the 7th century, are inhabiting a lot of what is now France and Germany, right? So Francia during that period also covers a lot of parts of
Mhm.
what we now call Germany. Charlemagne is a great conqueror. So his name actually is Charles. The Lemaine is Lemagne, the Great. So Carolus Magnus in Latin. On Christmas Day in the year 800, the Pope crowned him Emperor in the West, a title that had ceased to exist in the West with the fall of the last Roman emperor in 476, right? So this reconstitutes, in some senses, a Roman Empire in the West. Charlemagne's empire, at its greatest extent, stretches from Iberia to Prussia and from northern Germany into Italy. Right. So he has this really vast territory, and he is really quite good at ruling it. And he becomes kind of the touchstone for the rest of the Middle Ages and indeed beyond as what a king should be. And this is the sort of golden age, right? So Charlemagne's descendants, this whole thing kind of falls apart rather quickly with some help from the Vikings. In 843, Charlemagne's grandsons agreed to divide the empire amongst themselves. So they've been fighting a civil war, and they divide it into three parts. So they divide it into West Francia, which we can think of as the kernel of France, East Francia, which we can think of as the kernel of Germany, and then a bit in the middle, which they literally call the Middle Kingdom.
That's easy enough.
This kingdom later gets renamed Lotharingia, and then it gets absorbed mostly into East Francia, although it is still kind of a bone of contention between West and East Francia by the time we get to the first Capetians at the end of the 10th century. So there's this golden age, but then that is followed by this period of real churn where, boundaries are shifting back and forth, and also bloodlines are ending. So the East Frankish Carolingians die out, and that's taken over by a dynasty we call the Ottonians, because most of them are named Otto. But in the West, the Carolingian line continues until 987, when the last direct Carolingian ruler of West Francia dies. Although those West Frankian Carolingians had not been sitting on the throne uninterrupted, because since 88, another family called the Robertians was on the rise, and they had actually kind of been trading the throne back and forth with the West Frankish Carolingians for a full century before the king that we call the first Capetian, Hugh Capet, takes the throne. And Hugh is a Robertian. So we say he's the first Capetian, but he's actually the fourth of his line to have the West Frankish crown.
And when he comes to power, so let's talk about Hugh for a minute. It's not completely uncontested. In fact, it becomes a problem for the Capetians later on in the story of a lost library book, right? But let's talk about Hugh for a second. So Hugh is not everyone's first choice to be the king, but he ends up being the king anyway. How does this happen?
Okay, so Hugh, he is kind of the greatest prince in the kingdom. He is the Duke of the Franks. Now, what exactly does that mean? It means he's second, really, only to the king. And the Carolingian king, who's ruling, whom he is initially second to and helping, is his cousin Lothar. Their mothers are actually Ottonian princesses. And at first, Hugh is kind of Lothar's right-hand man. But then in 986, Lothar dies, and his son, who is not yet 20 years old, takes the throne. This is Louis V. Louis V is a real piece of work, and he manages to upset basically everybody, not only in the West Frankish kingdom, but in the Ottonian Empire as well. So a couple of important Ottonian supporters in West Francia, these churchmen, the Archbishop of Reims, a man named Adalbero, and a man named Gerbert, who goes on to become Pope Sylvester II, and who's very intellectually important, but very politically important as well. They sort of start looking at Hugh as an interesting alternative. And things had gotten pretty intense when suddenly, in May 987, Louis V dies in a hunting accident. And although he has not yet managed to produce, not even reached his 20th birthday, he hasn't, and been divorced once, he hasn't produced an heir. The only Carolingian candidate is Louis's uncle, so Lothar's brother, a man named Charles of Lorraine. Now, Charles thinks he should be king, but the barons and bishops of West Francia hold an assembly. And Adalbero, this Archbishop of France, who is allied with the Ottonians, stands up and says, look, we all know it should be Hugh because he is the strongest, he is the richest, he is really best placed to support both, our own private interests, but also the public good. So we should do that, especially because this other man, Charles, he's not up to it. And also, he has really made a very shameful marriage with a quite low-born woman. So his claim should be discounted. So the assembly agrees. Hugh is, you will sometimes hear that Hugh is elected king, by which we really mean chosen. In Latin, the word is the same. And then Adalbero has him crowned in the same city where Charlemagne was originally crowned. And then he takes him to the city of Reims itself, where he has him anointed with this special holy chrism that is said to have been brought by a dove down from heaven for the baptism of the first Christian king of the Franks, Clovis, around the year 500. Right? So there's the ascent of the barons, there's the crowning in the same place. Charlemagne was crowned, interestingly, in a city whose name means new. So I think there is a sense here that this is old, but also new. Mm-hmm. And then there is that sort of setting a divine seal upon it with the ceremony of anointing with this heavenly chrism.
So everything seems quite solid, although people are going to question this for centuries.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, Charles of Lorraine is still there, and it takes him about a year, but he does wage war on Hugh. Eventually, Hugh gets tricked into being captured, and he kind of disappears after that. Everything has been done to make Hugh's accession legitimate. And like I said, he's the fourth of his line to reign. It is not like he comes out of nowhere. Later, this is legend that he comes out of nowhere. Maybe he's even a Parisian butcher, mm-hmm. right? That's what Dante says. Mm-hmm. But no, he's a great prince. There's no reason he shouldn't have been king. But a sort of anti-tradition develops that there is something usurpatory about Hugh's accession. And that the Capetians have actually kind of just borrowed the crown of France. And that it will return to the Carolingian line initially after 7 generations. And when that doesn't happen, maybe it'll be, another 7 more.
You just can't tell with prophecies. They're so vague.
They are so vague. The best time to make a prophecy is after the thing has happened. And they do figure this out. You know, a lot of those prophecies are sort of ex post facto.
Right. Well, what's interesting about Hugh's choosing or election, however we want to say it, is that one of the arguments that they base it on is that this crown shouldn't be hereditary necessarily. It needs to be the best
Mm,
guy for the job. And
yeah.
this is fascinating because I think when people look back on the Middle Ages, they're like, well, it has to be hereditary. That's just how it is. But at this
Mhm.
time, that's not necessarily just how it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that way in the empire either. You know, there are electors in the empire. You know, it's not, I want to make clear to anyone listening that when we talk about elections, we're not talking about some kind of democratic plebiscite,
Hmm.
right? Whoever gets to choose, that's a very small circle of people. So when Adalbert is reported as saying this, that a kingdom cannot come to a man by hereditary right alone. It's true, but blood does count a lot.
Hmm.
And the Capetians show this clearly. You know, they already have kind of a dynastic principle in mind. Even before Hugh, you can see what the Robertians are doing to pass their patrimony on and to ensure succession. But it is ironic, very much so, that Adalbert says this, you know, not by hereditary right alone, but in doing so, what he has done there is inaugurated this hereditary line that goes on for 300 years, which is another thing I think that's important about that idea of hereditary right versus election or selection is that what the Capetians managed to do biologically is very unusual. And to a great extent, they just really get lucky, right? So
Yeah.
there aren't those occasions until the very end of the dynasty where people can get together and choose because the choice is always obvious.
Yeah. I mean, it's good to have a church loophole. Like they're built in so many places. Like, okay, but in this case, so then we have the first Capetian. And then, as you say, the line is super successful, father to son, as they go through the centuries. And one of the things I think people might be pulling out of what you're saying now is that you have Hugh as a prince among princes. And this is something that's like really characteristic of France at the beginning of the Capetian dynasty. And it kind of fades mostly, but not really, as the Middle Ages continue. So, what does France look like politically? Does it have just one guy at the top who's telling everyone what to do and they just do it? You're shaking your
No,
head.
no, absolutely not. West Francia is made up of great principalities. So I guess I should also just specify when we talk about princes in this period, we don't mean the king's son. We mean like great dukes and counts, though we might also talk about the king's son as a prince. So
Mhm.
great princes like the Duke of Aquitaine, the Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Barcelona, which Catalonia is still part of West Francia in this period. The Duke of Normandy, the Count of Flanders, the Count of Blois, the Count of Anjou, all of these people are basically running basically independent principalities. I mean, absolutely, there is something special about the king, not least because he is anointed. But Hugh and his immediate successors have almost no ability to make these people do what they say. So it is very much a process of making alliances through marriage, through mutual self-interest. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Very much an important principle in royal diplomacy at this time. But when that doesn't work out, you have to go to war. And the early Capetian kings are basically always at war.
Hmm. Because they're trying to get more control over these things. It's very hard, especially when you have the glowing example of Charlemagne, who seems to have been somebody who had more authority than they do. They're working towards this. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in time because I think the early Capetians are really fighting that war to like hold on with their fingernails to what they have. And it feels like the first guy who really has sort of a solid foundation on which to move this project forward is Philip Augustus. Do you think that's about right?
I would really date the turn in Capetian fortunes to the reign of Louis VI, who's also known as Louis the Fat, which makes him sound like he must have just sat in the palace eating sweets. But no, he was mostly on his horse fighting to expand the territory under direct royal control, but also to convince some of these barons that actually, when Louis tells them to do something, they are expected to do it.
That's fair. He's got a lot of muscle.
Yeah. He's big time muscle, but he also has a kind of secret weapon in that the abbot of a monastery called Saint-Denis, just north of Paris, he's quite close with this abbot. And this abbot has really interesting ideas about royal authority and about, how princes should be subordinate to the king and how maybe even the prince's subordinates should be subordinate ultimately to the king, right? So you might get almost something that looks like a feudal pyramid. Now, this doesn't at all work in terms of, there is never, I will just tell you now, there is never a feudal pyramid. It's just not a thing. I compare it for my students, and in fact, in the book, the forward to the book, it's more like a spaghetti bowl than it is like a pyramid. But there is certainly a growing sense that the king has the buck stops with the king. He has ultimate authority. Now, that doesn't look anything like the centralized authority of a modern state. Absolutely not. The whole way through. They're making alliances and having to go to war and so on. But certainly over the course of the 12th century, and I think absolutely you're right, culminating in the reign of Philip Augustus, who takes the throne as a 15-year-old in 1180, the king's power is growing. And Philip Augustus really takes that project and brings it to, I think it's almost its fullest expression, or certainly he expands it greatly. He is a really transformational figure. He's kind of the hinge point in the whole Capetian project. Sometimes historians talk even about the Capetian miracle, and that miracle begins with Philip Augustus.
That's why he gets called Augustus, right?
Yeah. Well, that's funny because it's one of his chroniclers who calls him Philip Augustus. And it didn't catch on at the time. Nobody called him Philip Augustus at the time. They called him Philip the God-given. But historians use it almost exclusively. It's much more common to hear Philip Augustus than Philip II.
Yeah,
because we're just so impressed. We all are. Secretly, he's all of our favorite Capetian, even though he was kind of personally unpalatable in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that about so many of them, but we had a discussion about Philip II, Philip Augustus, on the podcast earlier, looking at a chronicle, and the chronicler is like, he's Augustus, but he also really should just stick with his wife, which is a problem for a lot of these Capetians.
Yeah. Well, Philip got stuck in it was just a perfect storm of things, really. So he'd had this first wife, Elizabeth of Hainaut. She had produced a son. Yes, there had been some rough spots because Philip was not the most well-adjusted of individuals, especially when it comes to women. But then she died in childbirth. So Philip, he has a son, but, he has an heir, but he really needs a spare. And he's also a little bit worried. No, he's always worried about what's going on in England. So he marries a Danish princess, Ingeborg of Denmark. And as all medieval princesses are, she has famous beauty and she's cultivated, and the king just cannot wait to meet her. And he marries her the same day he meets her, and they have their wedding night. And then the next day, there's a coronation, and Philip starts to sweat and tremble. And immediately afterward, he sends Ingeborg away, and he refuses to have anything to do with her for the next 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately he starts trying to divorce her, and he won't really tell anybody why. So the French bishops get together. They're like, I guess they're too closely related. And okay, and they knew that this was not true. But Ingeborg says no and appeals to the Pope, whose ultimate authority it is to decide these things. And eventually she gets lucky because the Pope who's initially on the papal throne is slow to move. But the new Pope is a youngish man who takes the name Innocent III, and he is super energetic and he is really interested in marriage.
Yeah.
And he's actually, he innovates quite a lot in terms of marital norms that really provide a foundation still for marital norms in the Catholic Church today, which are codified in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1214. So between Ingeborg refusing to give up and consent to an annulment, and Innocent III, who's like, marriages, I know we used to dissolve marriages, and occasionally we still do. In the earlier Middle Ages, and if you think about Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine, this used to be not a painless thing, and certainly not granted in all cases, but a thing one could do. Innocent doesn't want that to happen anymore. This is partly because people are now thinking about the church as the bride of Christ. And Christ and the church are joined and they can't be parted. And so, men and women who have been joined together should also not be parted, particularly because Philip has to admit that he did have sex with Ingeborg, though eventually he settles on, and Ingeborg is also categorical on this, but eventually he settles on this claim that, okay, there was penetration, but there wasn't ejaculation because Philip had been temporarily, and only temporarily, been made impotent by magic.
I mean, he has to specify this is temporary, everyone. I'm still very manly.
Because in the meantime, he has married, in scare quotes, another woman and has had 2 children with her. So, and he also at one point takes a mistress and has a child by her as well. So Philip is definitely not permanently impotent. This is one case.
Very convenient.
Yeah, so I tell that story about Philip, and it is quite, it's a funny story. Of course, we have to have that story, but it is quite important in terms of the development of marriage law and a kind of shift in the way that the church is thinking about sex, too, as no longer maybe something that should be avoided if you possibly can. Maybe even if you're married, that's okay to avoid sex, to something that, it's okay. Lay married people should have sex. That's fine. Although that goes along with an increasing insistence on clerical celibacy. Really, that woman who you say is your maid, we know she's not your maid. You have to get rid of her.
Yeah.
You cannot just pass along this church to your son, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Innocent is just such a killjoy. But as you say, like you can't separate even like these massive church laws from the personalities that are going about their business because it is so important. All right, we only have a short time to be talking, so we've talked about the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, maybe one of the peaks of the Capetian dynasty in Philip Augustus. Okay, how does it end? This is something I'm getting into in my series, The Iron King, but it's okay to spoil it. It is a major, we were just talking about this before we turned on the microphone, that like, this is a series of own goals, or like you look at it and you're shaking your head just thinking about it. How does the Capetian dynasty end? It's stunning. Stunning.
Yeah, I mean, like we were talking about, it's like someone who trips and falls through a plate glass window, and that shorts out the electricity, and then there's a fire, and then the entire block explodes, right? It's been going so well. So yeah, I should just mention quickly about Philip Augustus, because mostly what we talked about is his temporary magical impotence. He does actually also take away most of the Plantagenet Empire, except for Gascony. and he makes the crown incredibly rich, and then his son conquers Languedoc, and then his grandson, Louis IX, is this incredibly saintly and prestigious figure who goes on crusade, who becomes sainted in 1297. So by 1297, the Capetians actually have someone who rivals Charlemagne, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've got that figure where they can say, and by now everybody calls them the most Christian kings, right? They're undisputedly the most prestigious and wealthy and powerful kingdom in Christendom. Everybody looks up to them. All right.
And then, and then.
So in 1285, son Louis IX's grandson, a man named Philip IV, or Philip the Fair, becomes king. Philip really wants to be like Louis. He would love to be like Louis. He is really not like Louis.
At all.
At all. But what he has inherited from his ancestors, and I often ask my students this question: did Philip the Fair perfect or destroy his predecessor's legacy? And, of course, the answer to that is in a way both.
Mm-hmm.
So Philip really tries to expand the reach of royal authority. And it's in his reign where we see the most conflict between the crown and the nobility, not just the great princes, but people a lot lower down the scale as well, because Philip and his lawyers, and by now medieval states really rule through law more than they do through force, try and get a much stronger grip on the kingdom. And they are much more able to compel people to do things. And indeed, they even try compelling the Pope to do things. Unfortunately, it's kind of like Philip Augustus and Innocent III. They were unlucky to have one another.
Mm-hmm.
Philip IV and Boniface VIII are very unlucky to have one another because they are both very uncompromising characters. But Philip, and indeed his lawyers, are willing to really push that envelope. So what ends up happening is Philip's lawyers go in with some of Boniface VIII's worst enemies and end up literally scaring the Pope to death, right?
Mm-hmm.
Philip also basically destroys the Knights Templar by accusing them of heresy and sodomy and a whole laundry list of crimes they did not commit. So I call that section of the book a reign of terror. And I think for many people it really was, because there's this thing that happens in the psyche of medieval people around this time where they start believing in basically conspiracy theories in a way that, people in the 12th and 13th centuries were much more rational about these kind of things. But, now suddenly there are demons everywhere. Philip dies in 1314. The realm is basically in a state of revolt because all the barons have gotten together and they brought the common people on side and said, look, you are ruling like a tyrant, and also you are raising taxes for wars that you don't actually then prosecute. So we want our money back and we want a lightening of this authoritarian burden. The crown passes to his son. Normal Capetian thing, right? But then that king, Louis X, dies after reigning for only a year and a half, and he doesn't have a son. Well, in fact, he leaves his queen pregnant, and she does bear a boy, but that boy dies 4 days later. Mm-hmm. What he has left is a daughter named Joan, and her paternity is suspect because one of the things that Philip the Fair had done was have two of his daughters, well, all three of his daughters-in-law, in fact, arrested for adultery, and two of them convicted and sent away to live out their miserable lives in a terrible dungeon, essentially. So this 4-year-old girl's paternity is not she's almost certainly legitimate. Mm-hmm. But the real issue is not that she's illegitimate or even that she's female, because women inherit fiefs, principalities, indeed kingdoms, all the time. 20% of the time, the heir is female among the elites of medieval Europe. Joan's problem is her uncle really wants to be king. And he, I don't think it's too strong to say that he usurps the throne. He certainly has himself crowned before there is universal agreement that the throne belongs to him. And he has it decided after his coronation that women may not inherit the throne of France. Now, this is before they start attributing this to the Salic law, so they're not invoking the Salic law. Mm-hmm. Now, this is all fine and well for Philip when he does this because he has a son. But 2 weeks later, that son dies. And Philip...
It's not funny, but like, oh my gosh.
Well, there's a very clear sense in the chroniclers that Philip has brought this on himself. Mm-hmm. This is what you get for doing this kind of underhanded thing. Mm-hmm. And Philip V never has another son. So when he dies in 1322, right, so another very short reign of mysterious causes. And some people think he was poisoned, and maybe he was, because he, like his father, Philip the Fair, was real keen on being very authoritarian and on taxing people a lot. The throne passes to the third and last son, Charles IV. Charles IV, I think, would actually have made a really good king had he been able to stick with it for very long. But he dies 6 years later. And at that point, he has gone through 3 queens and has not managed. He does have a son at one point. Again, I think that baby is actually stillborn. He again leaves his wife pregnant. And ironically, on April Fool's Day, when the queen bears her baby, it's a girl. So at that point, the direct male Capetian line dies out in 1328. When Charles IV dies. And so again, we have an assembly, right? So the Capetian line is bookended by these assemblies, and the assembly decides that the crown should pass to a man named Philip of Valois, who is the grandson of Philip the Fair's next youngest brother, a man named Charles of Valois. Now, Philip the Fair still has one living child. That is Queen Isabel of France. And Isabel has a son by then, Edward III. So there are representations made about this. And of course, Louis X's son, Joan, who was disinherited when her uncle wanted to take the throne. Instead, she's still around, and she does not yet have a son. But she was actually pregnant at the time, and she will have a son. And eventually her son will show back up along with Edward III. So Edward III will claim, I'm the proper king of France. But Joan's son will also say I'm the proper king of France. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like the Capetian line ends up splintering in a way.
And it's just such a strange and explosive end. When you think about it, even though it's a slow dying and that you have one king and then the next and then the next, and none of them have heirs. But when you think about the stability that was created over the last century, and then because of this and some really bad decisions made by the last few Capetians, it leads to the 100 Years' War, or at least what people justify as being the reason for the 100 Years' War, which devastates huge parts of France. Yeah. What a story.
I gotta say, I think that very much the governmental apparatus that the Capetians from the time of Philip Augustus, and you can even see this a little bit before, but really starting with Philip Augustus, that governmental apparatus, those specialized offices that they put into place with a whole group of specialized officers who actually are very nepotistic and very, they intermarry. So the Capetians themselves die out, but the institutions they've created and that kind of institutional knowledge lives on. And it's really very much those people, those bureaucrats who do keep the thing running over the course of the 100 Years' War, when, the things that happen to the Valois make the things that happen to the Capetians look like child's play. I mean, gee.
That's your next book. Right, there you go. Okay, so before we wrap up, we have like this massive cast of huge characters, and I hope that people are getting a sense of that from this, because all of them have a great story. So I need to ask you the question everyone asks, which is, do you have a favorite?
Oh, it changes with the weather. But these days I'm kind of thinking, yeah, maybe it's Blanche of Castile, which is someone we haven't mentioned. Although, I will say queens are a hugely important part of this book. So
Yes.
Blanche of Castile is the mother of Louis the Ninth, son Louis. Louis accedes to the throne when he's 12 years old, so she's got a long regency and quite a lot of. She's really responsible for setting the seal on the expansionary project that Philip Augustus and his son, Louis VIII, Blanche of Castile's husband, had been pursuing over the last decade. She's the one who really makes this fly. And she's just a very interesting character. I mean, there are adultery accusations against her as well. And she has to face down a baronial rebellion just after she has had her last child. So I think, yeah, she's a very, very interesting and admirable woman in many, many ways. So this week, Blanche of Castile is my favorite.
I think that's a good choice. I think that should stick as your favorite for at least a couple of days.
Yeah. We'll see which way the wind blows.
Thank you so much, Justine, for coming and introducing us to the Capetian dynasty. It is such a fascinating period of history and place and people. And I'm so glad that you have written this book and that you're sharing it with people. So thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, it was delightful. Thank you so much for having me.
To find out more about Justine's work, you can visit her faculty page at the University of St. Andrews. Her new book is House of Lilies, the dynasty that made medieval France. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, I had a pretty good weekend.
Good.
How about you?
I did. I went to the Robin in the Hood Festival in Elmira, Ontario, which is really, really fun. Took the kids. We had a great time. So that's what I did this weekend. What did you do?
I was in the middle of Toronto at the University of Toronto listening to a dramatic reading of a play called The Infatuated and the Ravishing.
Ooh, that sounds spicy.
It was indeed. So this is a play by a guy named Ibn Danièle. He was living in Cairo, and it's around the turn of the 14th century. So it is a very spicy play, and it's just been translated, and they're kind of working towards making it what we call a shadow play, as it was originally done. But it's a tale of a guy named the Infatuated and his boyfriend, the Ravishing.
Ooh.
And alas, he is forlorn with love for him, but it is not reciprocated. And it leads to a whole bunch of adventures, some animal fighting, a big barbecue, fun stuff. And the Angel of Death appears too. So.
Oh, well, I mean, It's not a party until the Angel of Death shows up, right?
Yeah. And the characters that you hear and see and they talk to you, they're really kind of fun. There's like Miss Banana, Nubian Nilefish, Big Woody, and Lurker Alert.
Wow.
So these are accurate translations from the original Arabic texts. So again, very spicy stuff. But I'm really I had a really fun time just listening to a dramatic reading, which is very dramatic. That was a lot of fun. And I'm looking forward to seeing more what they're going to do with this 14th century play.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. And I love that kind of thing where you can see a play. Well, I'm always into plays, but when you see something that shows the type of medieval humor people had, which is a lot spicier than people might think these days.
Indeed. One little bit of info I found out is that the person Ibn Danièle had written like 2 other plays. And in one of them, there's a character in Cairo who's a female tattoo artist.
Ooh, that's awesome.
So if you were wondering if there was tattoos in medieval Cairo, yes, there was. And you could go to at least one woman who was doing that.
Well, one character.
Indeed. I'm hoping that it's actually based on a true person. It sounds like it was. So.
You never know. But I mean, I was expecting there would be some pretty amazing tattoos in medieval Cairo. That was just my assumption. So very cool that you have this character showing up in this play.
Mm-hmm. In terms of like news, right now we're covering this thing that's erupted online, which is the journal Anglo-Saxon England has changed its name to Early Medieval England and Its Neighbors. It's from Cambridge University Press. The big debate over this is that are they limiting the term Anglo-Saxon? And if you kind of remember back a couple of, about 3-4 years ago, there was a bit of a debate over that term. Some people see it as like white nationalism or racist. It gets used in ways that I don't think medievalists quite like. But there's been debate back and forth about that. And it kind of quieted down in the last recent years. And this announcement from last month has kind of touched off people around the world. So there's more debate. So we're taking a look at that too.
Yes. Well, I mean, I remember when this was perhaps at its height, when the debate was at its height, people were talking about this journal not actually covering just England anyway. So I remember, at least if I'm remembering it correctly, they were thinking this is a good time to refresh the name of the journal anyway. So it's not something that has got a bee in my bonnet. I'm totally cool with it. But if people want to know more about the discussion, I suppose they can check it out at medievalist.net, right?
Indeed. So we've got that. Plus, we have a really good article from Stephen Mulberger on the unsung heroes of medieval warfare, which are, of course, clerks.
Yes. I thought you were going to say horses. I guess people do sing about horses, but not clerks. You're right.
It's a really good piece looking at like all the little things they did administrative wise. Armies couldn't fight without a bunch of people writing letters.
That's true. And we wouldn't know anything about their supplies if it wasn't for clerks. So we as historians owe them a lot. So hopefully that is what Stephen's getting at in this article, right?
Indeed. So we have all that plus much, much more.
All right. Thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
If your appetite for Capetians has been whetted, good news. Episode 3 of my mini-series, This Is History Presents the Iron King, dropped this week, featuring evil lawyers, a drunken bishop shooting his mouth off, and a pope getting his face rearranged. And in celebration of the Iron King, Sony is giving everyone a free month of This Is History Plus, so you can finish out the season ad-free. Listen to my weekly bonus chats with Dan Jones and access the rest of his entire This Is History back catalog. All you have to do is sign up before June 18th, and you'll have hundreds of ad-free episodes in your headphones. Check it out at thisishistorypod.com or wherever you're listening to this podcast. There are only about 10 days left to get your ticket if you're interested in the talk I'm giving in Toronto as part of the 100th anniversary of the Richard III Society this year. You can roll up and chow down at the celebratory luncheon at Montgomery's Inn or catch it on Zoom on Saturday, July 6th. Ticket sales will close on June 15th, so get your tickets soon. To find out more, please visit Richard III, that's richardii.ca/branch-news. Thank you, as always, for your amazing support, especially if you're a patron on patreon.com, because patrons are the superheroes who allow me to do this work in the first place. If you'd like to become a patron, please head over to patreon.com/medievalists. Or if you'd like to support my work another way, you can visit tpublic.com/stores/medievalistsnet to pick up some sweet medieval merch and show off your awesomeness. Either way, thank you. For everything from kings to rings, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a fantastic day.